Hello, NAAIA community. Get ready to relive insightful discussions, gain fresh perspectives, and be inspired by the wealth of knowledge our community has to offer. Let's dive into another episode.
I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's program. Susan Johnson has been the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at the Hartford since 2013. Notably, under her leadership, the Hartford was recognized with the Catalyst Award in 2023, the premier global recognition organizational DEI initiatives that drive representation and inclusion for women. At NAAIA, Johnson has served in a variety of roles on the national board, including programs chair, secretary, and now treasurer. She is a proud alumna of Spelman College and received her master's degree in industrial and labor relations from Cornell University. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm NAAIA welcome to our moderator for today's program, Ms. Susan Johnson.
Thanks, Camilla, and welcome everybody. I'd like to extend my own welcome on behalf of the board of the National African American Insurance Association. And for those of you who may not know, we were organized to create a network among people of color in the insurance industry. And we're proud of our 2,100 members and our 24 chapters across the country. And of course, since it's February, we have a host of events to commemorate Black History Month, and we're very excited to kick things off with this event today, featuring Dr. Kevin Woodson from the University of Richmond. I'll be introducing Professor Woodson in just 1 minute, but let me just say that the NAAIA National Webinar Series allows you to engage with experts and thought leaders on emerging trends in the insurance industry, and our goal is to make sure that we provide you all with the tools and strategies you need to successfully navigate your work and your careers. To do that today, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Kevin Woodson, who is a professor of law at the University of Richmond School of Law. He earned his PhD in sociology and social policy from Princeton University, his JD from Yale Law School, and his BA from Columbia University. He writes and speaks on a range of legal and policy issues affecting Black Americans. His scholarship has appeared in Fordham Law Review, Cardozo Law Review, and Georgia Law Review, among other venues. And before coming to the University of Richmond, he was an associate professor at the Thomas R. Klein School of Law at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And before that, Professor Woodson worked as an associate at a major Washington, D.C. law firm. We're excited because Professor Woodson's book, titled The Black Ceiling: How Race Still Matters in the Elite Workplace, was published in 2023. And it's that body of work that will be the focus for today's session. So welcome, Professor Woodson. So happy to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh boy, I can't wait to get started to help our audience understand more about your research. And I'd like to do that by providing you an opportunity to give a little bit of background on yourself, your early education, and your professional experiences that shaped the research that ultimately became this book.
Sure. Where do I begin? I guess you could say that attending some of the schools I attended brought me into contact with a lot of people who went on to careers in these types of firms. And it really gave me a lot of insight into some of the challenges that people face. So having a lot of friends and classmates who were working at big law firms or investment banks or in consulting or in corporate America really kind of opened my eyes to a world that I didn't know existed before I had graduated from college. And it let me realize that a lot of people were very uncomfortable, even people who didn't have specific claims of discrimination or specific incidents that they could point to and say, this is where I was treated unfairly. And so that kind of was always in the back of my mind, even when I was working as an attorney. I just found this interesting. I also found it interesting that not everyone had the same experiences. So there were some people at these same firms working in the same jobs who just seemed to have a much easier time. Some of them were superstars on the rise. Others were just maybe not as successful, but happy. And so I stored kind of all this in the back of my mind. I was a lawyer at the time, and Hadn't really thought about actually studying this for a living, but I ended up going back to grad school, and I talked about this with one of my advisors, and she really pushed me to study this and to really try to provide a new perspective on the challenges and problems, and also on the progress in some respects that people have made in this space. So that's sort of my, in a nutshell, my background story here.
It's fascinating, and I really appreciate your aspirations to be a continuous learner, to go from being a lawyer to being an academician, and now a professor is an exciting background for this book. And some of our audience members they might be familiar with other ceiling terms like the glass ceiling, the concrete ceiling, or the bamboo ceiling that speaks to barriers faced by women, Black women, Asian American professionals, respectfully. But how are you describing the Black ceiling in your work?
Well, so the Black ceiling, of course, builds on the same metaphor, if you will, or analogy, where the general concept is the same, that there's something that's going on in these firms or organizations or in these industries that consistently prevents Black people, Black workers from rising to the top. And it can be really difficult to figure out what the problem is or where it's happening. But this is something where if you step back and you look at the numbers over time, it's remarkably consistent and systematic. And so that's the general thinking behind the term itself. One thing I do want to point out, though, and this is something that can lead to misunderstanding of the term, is that it's not referring to like a literal ceiling in the sense that everything is going well as people work their way up to the top, and then all of a sudden they run into this ceiling and now they can't go further. It's really more of a metaphor for all of the accumulated burdens and barriers and disadvantages that undermine people at every step of the way, including in some instances from the moment they're hired.
Yeah, that's pretty comprehensive in terms of the whole systemic strategies that you're talking about in your book. And I noted that some of your research really focuses on professional services careers, such as law firms, management consulting, investment banking. Some people would consider these to be aspirational careers. And to some degree, we position the insurance industry as one that, very much like law, can be financially lucrative and flexible and enabling you to create the life that you want. We have a lot of professional thought kind of roles, knowledge roles. But in your work, you talked about something that I thought was really fascinating, and that is the various forms of capital that are especially important in these professional services industries. And I think also in the insurance industry. And I think people would be aided by understanding more about your perspective on the various forms of capital that are important for us to consider.
Yeah, so I'm glad that that concept resonated. That was something that I won't bore you with all the fine details about the research and writing process, but I had a really hard time figuring out how to determine who succeeded and who didn't, or what does success look like in these areas. So I really had to look at the interviews that I conducted and read the transcripts and figure out what it was that people talked about when they were describing whether or not their careers were going well. And so I came up with this concept of career capital, which really refers to a whole variety of resources and accolades that either can help you build a successful career, or in some instances already signal that you're on your way to a successful career. So I can talk about them briefly in turn. There are, I think, 5 different types that I mentioned in the book, and most of these are used in the social sciences, so I can't take credit for inventing all these terms. But so you have human capital, which typically refers to the skills that you develop through either your formal learning or your experiential learning, on the job. And that, of course, comes from getting access to high quality assignments, and in some instances, mentorship support that can help you develop that human capital. Reputational capital is also something that it's kind of self-explanatory. Having a high quality reputation is very important in the professional workspace. This is how you get future opportunities. This is how you get promotions, perhaps. And so this can come from reputation with clients or with other colleagues or people at other competitor firms even. And that's also something you gain from having access to the right opportunities, and also by having mentors and sponsors who are going to go to bat for you and say good things, sing your praises to anyone. That's how you actually develop that capital. There's also social capital, which is a common term in sociology. And that just really refers to the quality and quantity of your relationships. So not just who you know, but also what they might be willing to and able to do for you. So social capital is looking at kind of the resources you have just based on who you know and the strength of those relationships. And then financial capital, of course, speaks for itself. That's the money that you're earning, which is in many instances the kind of core consideration for a lot of folks. And then cultural capital is something I emphasize. This is something that sociologists talk about a lot, usually in different contexts. But the idea here is that your cultural repertoire, so your cultural toolkit, the things you know about, your interests, the things you can make small talk about, these can all play a surprisingly powerful role in helping you build relationships with other people, or even just impressing other people, because they might assume that because you have certain things in common with them, that you're also a smart person with great taste, who they can trust. So all of this is sort of encompassed in the concept of career capital. And it's especially important for professional workers because most professional workers don't stay in the same place their whole careers. So in the modern economy, this isn't limited to professionals, but it's just really likely that anyone starting their career in a professional role is going to move at least once or twice over the course of their careers, and sometimes many times more than that. And so these forms of capital are things that you can take with you. So these are things that are going to help you get access to other opportunities at other firms, or new accounts with new clients. And they're going to end up rewarding you even if things don't work out at your first firm, or even if you choose to leave for whatever reason. And because people expect to leave, these are the things that they're focused on. They're not focused on, am I going to get a promotion? They're focused on, am I getting the right opportunities? Am I building the right relationships? Are people actually speaking about me in a positive manner that's going to help me down the road? So sort of a long-winded way of explaining what all these capitals are, but I do think they're very important concepts, and hopefully I'm planning to circle back to them later when I give people more insight into this.
Yes. Yeah. And I think your comment again about the fact that these levels of capital follow you also resonates in the insurance industry, because even though it's a very large industry, it's also, very relatively small. People go from firm to firm or from organization to organization, and the aspects of capital that follow them around, I think, is an important one for our audience to keep in their minds. And now let's talk a little bit about the aspect of race in this conversation. And, there's no question that racial bias and discrimination are systemically embedded in our society and our workplaces in ways that we all must be conscious of and challenge. And your research talks about something that I thought was very thought-provoking, and that is the concept of racial discomfort. Can you focus in on that? And then as you do, I'll just point out for the audience's ears to be perked up, Professor Woodson has a concept around racial risk management, which is an important concept of risk management for us to consider. But let me please invite you to just give us a little bit more insights in your concepts around racial discomfort and how risk management plays into that.
So I'm nervous now because usually I talk about racial risk management in front of people who have no idea what risk management is. So they just nod their heads and it sounds good. So I feel like I might get tough questions here. But racial discomfort is really just this general sense of unease that a lot of Black workers experience in these predominantly white-dominated workspaces. And I say predominantly white or white-dominated in the sense that demographically, they're disproportionately white, especially in positions of power, but also in other ways. So culturally, a lot of these institutions are white because they reflect the culture of the people within them. And also symbolically. So there's some places like law firms often get into hot water sometimes because there'll be like some old paintings on the wall that have a romanticized scene involving slavery or plantation life or something. So there are just many ways where these spaces weren't really built for all the people who currently inhabit them. And so all of these factors together can cause various problems, various types of unease for the Black professionals who are trying to build their careers there. And there are really two different types of racial discomfort. One is what I refer to as social alienation, the other is stigma anxiety. And racial risk management is a result of the latter. So I don't know if should I get into the two different types of racial discomfort?
Yes, please.
So for social alienation, you have the problem that it comes when you don't really fit in completely with your colleagues because of differences in your personal life, your background, your experiences, your preferences. And so in a lot of subtle ways, you feel like you don't fit in, you don't feel like you fully belong to the institution, belong in the institution, the same way that all of your white colleagues might. And that can be very frustrating. It can be isolating, alienating. So in addition to being stressful, it can also make it that much harder to access the types of capital that we were just discussing. So it's harder to get reputational capital if you're not out there mingling with your colleagues, harder to build relationship capital that way as well. And so there are a lot of issues that come along with social alienation. And but to get back to your racial risk management question, so that's a product of stigma anxiety. So stigma anxiety, and I apologize for all the terms, but is something that it's really just a way to describe the sense of apprehension that a lot of Black workers feel when they have to worry about whether colleagues or clients or other people might treat them unfairly or discriminate against them on the basis of race. So in other words, you know that there's a chance that someone in the room has certain negative biases or assumptions about you. You don't know who, and you don't know if it's ever going to actually affect anything, but you recognize that there's this risk that you will be mistreated. And so because of that, people attempt to manage that risk by engaging in certain types of tactics that are technically either coping mechanisms or defensive mechanisms. And the point there is that you want to try to protect yourself from any of these people misinterpreting your work or treating you unfairly or saying negative things about you or assuming the worst because of your race. And so this often leads to a number of understandable reactions that I argue are actually counterproductive for your career in the long run. And so this is challenging, I know, for a lot of folks, but one of the common manifestations of this is people trying to put their heads down, go into survival mode, work hard, and hope that their hard work gets recognized and they don't do anything to make themselves look bad. And so that's sort of a survival mode to your work. And in the firms that I study, and I imagine in many other professions as well, that's just not a recipe for success. It's a recipe for survival, but it's going to be really hard to actually thrive and to actually climb the ranks if your main objective is to avoid putting yourself in the position to be discriminated against. And so that's one of the ways that racial risk management, while it's completely understandable, and to some extent it's unavoidable perhaps, but there really is a potential downside there that I think not enough people are really talking about or thinking about. And so that's just one example. Another example is that, and this might seem more trivial, but people feeling like they don't want to open up to their colleagues because you might work in a workplace where there's a lot of small talk, or even people hang out on the weekends sometimes, and there's a lot of chit chat about family life and what their kids are up to. And you might not feel comfortable engaging in that because you might sense, well, anything I say, they're going to use to discredit me, or they're going to look at it through a warped lens of racial stereotypes. And so this could end up actually working to my disadvantage. And so some people respond to that by shutting down completely. Or one of the people I interviewed described it as putting up a wall. So she said, I put up the wall and I think I'm suffering because of that. So again, not to blame her. Some of my interviewees are harder on themselves than I am. I think that they're blaming themselves too much for this, but it is something people come to recognize. And sometimes it's just a little too late for them to change course, because if you've really been focused on that racial risk management approach, it can kind of really just become deeply ingrained in how you approach your colleagues, what your identity is like in the workplace. And it can be hard to pivot, not impossible, but it certainly takes a lot of effort and a lot of conscious, putting yourself out there and being uncomfortable.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I was also intrigued by the fact that, it can become sort of a catch-22, this vicious cycle. And, it might be helpful for us to step back a little bit and, maybe talk about how you did your research and the fact that you talked to many, many, many people. And there was a little nugget in your response there that acknowledged that some people thrive in environments like this, that it's not always a negative experience for Black people. So maybe just paint the picture of who and how you gathered information that turned into this book. And when did you see people thrive versus struggle? What contributed to their different experiences?
Okay, so I'll break that into two. And at first I'll talk about the process for the book. I never know how much people want to hear about this. Obviously, it's interesting to me, but
well, Camilla failed to mention the fact that I majored in sociology at Spelman, so I'm all in. But
I didn't know that.
It's helpful for people to have an appreciation for your research.
Oh, well, that's great to hear. So, I guess I would say to back up a bit. So I kind of I left off at this part. So I talked about going back to grad school and studying this. So originally, I went in and was focusing on this just for a seminar paper. So this was going to be one of those papers that you have to do to check off a box in grad school. So I interviewed 30 people at that point and wrote up maybe it was a 30, 40-page paper on this topic. And my advisor read it and just pushed me to make it my whole dissertation. So I ended up really expanding it. I ended up interviewing a total of around 150 Black people, including 110 who worked at the specific types of firms that I was really interested in studying. A lot of other people worked in like corporations or the medical profession. So people who were in very prestigious jobs, but I just felt that there were too many differences between what they did and how their careers were structured versus how the lawyers and other people's careers were structured. So I can talk about that later if anyone's interested. But so I ended up really just focusing on the 110 interviews that I conducted of lawyers, investment bankers, and management consultants. I also interviewed a bunch of non-Black workers as well, just to get a little more perspective. But so these 110 interviews started off through this process that we refer to as snowball sampling, where the technical term is respondent-driven sampling. And so how this works is you find people to interview, and then you ask them for referrals, essentially. And you have to be really clear that you're not trying to shape the sample in any way. You want people, no matter what their experience is, no matter what their perspectives, as long as they'd be willing to speak, I'm willing to listen. And so that's how I ended up getting all of these people from around the country in different cities and different firms. And then I had to actually go back. I interviewed them all myself. And I ended up going back and listening to the recordings and reviewing the transcripts over and over again over the years, and really started to look for patterns. So I was really trying to understand why some people have better outcomes than others, but which is a very, very difficult thing to do, because no matter what, you're going to overgeneralize. There are always going to be exceptions who don't fit whatever pattern it is you notice. So that can be frustrating and difficult. But just listening to their experiences and really trying to keep an open mind and not assuming that I knew more than them, really opened my eyes to the importance of the problems that we discussed already. So this notion of social alienation and stigma anxiety. These were terms that I made up, so it's not like I already had them in mind, but just listening to the interviews helped. And then, so as I mentioned, one of the things that I was interested in was figuring out the differences between who succeeded or who thrived, because sometimes it's subjective. They might not be getting promotions, but at least they feel accepted and like they're being treated well, versus the people who had the worst experiences. And so there are a lot of differences. So just looking at the people who thrive, so this isn't sufficient to succeed, but it's necessary. You obviously have to be good at your job, period. You have to have the talent or whatever necessary skills or work habits or practices are valued in your field. You have to have that no matter what. Especially being a Black professional, you're going to need to have that piece to get people to trust, to inspire the trust, and to have people want to champion your careers. So that's one thing. Obviously, some people have that and still don't thrive. So it's not to say that that's sufficient for success, but it's certainly necessary and important. There's also an element of chance. So this is something that sociologists tend to overlook, but in some instances, some people just happen to be in the right place at the right time, and that can make all the difference in your entire career. So there are people I interviewed who happened to be in the office one morning when some senior partner was desperate to find someone to work with. And so the partner runs into their office. They've never met before. And it's like, can you help me with this right now? And they say, sure. And then it goes well. And that's where obviously the talent and ability comes in. And the next thing you know, they're the partner's right-hand woman. And then years later, they're partners. So things like that do happen. I don't want to exaggerate how much it's just all luck and chance, but it can play a role. Or conversely, if your first assignment is with someone who's just really unfair and unhelpful and basically doesn't like you and decides to badmouth you to some of his peers, you're going to have a really hard time getting from under that in some instances. So that kind of luck or chance can play a factor as well. But the thing that I noticed the most that people I think have the most control over is the relationship piece. I think that a lot of people might have heard the sayings about how it's not what you know, it's who you know. And people have some kind of vague, abstract sense that relationships matter, but they really matter. And they can matter at each step of the way along your career trajectory. And so relationships help you get the better assignments sooner than some of your colleagues might. They also help you understand how to perform well on those assignments. They provide you the information that you need, like the kind of unwritten rules, or even just the specific information about what specific senior colleagues of yours are looking for, or what specific clients want. So all of that comes easier if you have strong relationships and rapport with people who can give you that information and that support. And also people who have the right relationships are going to have people advocating for them from positions of power. So people who can, in some instances, help you keep your job during layoffs, or help ensure that you get put on a really high profile case or given some kind of opportunity. Or even there are people who get bonuses that they weren't even eligible for because they have this really powerful champion who is saying, look, I've worked with her very closely and she's great. I don't care what the numbers say, she deserves this. And so that's actually happened. That happened to one of the people I interviewed. So there are the one common thread is that the people who succeeded, 99% of them, that's a made up statistic, but it's got to be close, had at least one, if not two, senior white partners at their firms who were really just behind them, supporting them, guiding them. So that's not to say that other relationships don't matter. In many instances, if you can find a senior Black partner, you might be even better off. The problem is they don't always exist. And so depending on the demographics of your institution, you might have to actually find ways to build those relationships with people who are very different than you. And so that's one thing that I noticed as a common reoccurring theme through these interviews. And they bring them up without me even asking. It would just be, my main sponsor is this middle-aged Republican guy. We hit it off somehow, and he's been great ever since. So I would say that is, like I said, I hate to generalize, but that is a really big difference between the people who had great experiences and the people who did not.
I'm just going to put in a plug again for your book, because it's incredibly readable, and it provides a really academic look at some of the things I'll bet the majority of people on this call are familiar with. Again, it's Professor Kevin Woodson, The Black Ceiling, How Race Still Matters in the Elite Workplace, and it was just published in 23. Before we go to Q&A, and you all are invited to put a question in the Q&A spot, I just want to make sure that we put out there actions and advice that you might have. I love that you kind of wrapped up your last answer with one action that senior leaders in the workplace can take, and that is to invest in the relationship and the support of their Black talent. Are there other ideas that you have that either a firm or an organization can take, or for us as individuals, what could we do to help navigate the Black ceiling?
Sure. Well, I think firms and organizations can do a whole lot, although some of it has to come from individuals themselves who are willing and interested in being powerful allies and sponsors. But at the very least, firms can do what they can to try to limit the role of discretion and favoritism in determining who gets access to the career capital. And so what I mean by that is there are many workplaces where you're kind of left to your own devices to figure out who gets what assignments or opportunities. It's based on networking, or kind of they'll call it being entrepreneurial in your own career, but in many instances, it just means the people who are in close with the people who are more senior to them end up getting more opportunities, better treatment, more favorable reviews than everyone else. And so to the extent possible, firms need to really try to limit that. Sometimes it's not possible, but they need to really be mindful of the potential downside of this arrangement. And that's that it's really harmful for people who are not in the majority group sometimes. And so that's one thing that firms can do across the board, to the extent that they haven't already. They need to really think long and hard about how they can make things even more systematic, and also to monitor how people are doing in their careers. So in many instances, as I mentioned, these are problems that start very early on. So it's not something that firms have to wait 4 or 5 years to figure out how someone's doing. In many instances, if you ask the right questions, or if you look for the right information, you can see some of these problems in the first few months in some instances. And so employers and firms who really want to do better, and whether that's for moral reasons or legal reasons or PR reasons, whatever the case may be, they need to really start monitoring and trying to track this information, especially if it becomes apparent that there are junior or young Black workers who are isolated, whether they're being isolated, or whether something just seems off and they don't seem to be getting the same kinds of opportunities. Someone at the firm level has to be on top of that and has to make sure that that doesn't persist, because it can be easier to treat it earlier on than after a year or two. Another thing is some firms can do, employers can try to double down or triple down on their mentorship and sponsorship programs. So many firms have these formal mentorship programs that they don't really put a lot of weight in. And it ends up being like a formality. You meet with this random mentor of yours maybe once a year, if that, and you have this awkward conversation because you two don't even know each other, or he has to remember who you are. That's not very useful, but it can be incredibly useful if you have someone who you're seeing quarterly or more frequently than that, or better yet, if you have multiple people that you can see quarterly. And then you're really getting plugged in, and the odds are that at least one of them might somehow form enough rapport with you to kind of take an interest in your career and actually do something to help you. So little things like that can be really helpful, especially because in most workplaces, we're dealing with very small numbers here. So the difference between, let's say, 5 Black people being promoted to manager versus 2 can be huge statistically. I mean, that's math isn't my strong suit. It seems like a 150% increase. But we're talking about 3 people. And so something like that can make a really big difference. And it also has a ripple effect. This is something I haven't discussed yet, but since I'm talking now, I'm going to mention it, which is that for better or for worse, the successes and struggles of Black professionals and Black workers are seen by everyone else. So it doesn't just affect them, it affects all the Black workers who are coming up behind them. And it can really shape perceptions. It can really feed racial discomfort if these firms are consistently failing to promote Black people. But on the other hand, if a firm is doing a good job, that word gets out and people might start to gravitate toward that firm and try to figure out how they can start working there. And so you see that I'm more familiar with that in the context of law firms, because you'll have some firms that have much better reputations than others. So those are some of the things that firms and employers can do. But I would emphasize that individual senior workers have a lot of power and discretion to do this themselves. There's nothing stopping them from seeing someone and saying, hey, I really want to get to know you, and I'd like to help you with your career here. So let's do lunch or dinner, or, whatever is appropriate, and to build from there. I think that something like that can be incredibly helpful. The second part of your question was, what can Black professionals themselves do? And so that can be tricky, because obviously it depends on your circumstances. If you're just in a situation where you're being treated really unfairly and there's just no light at the end of the tunnel, you might have to leave. In some instances, that's the best way to help yourself. But assuming things haven't gotten that dire yet and you're not in that kind of a situation, I think one of the things you have to do is remember at all times the value of career capital, and to really make it a point to try to proactively seek it out and not assume that it's going to come to you, or not preoccupy yourself with other potential goals. You have to really look at career capital as being what you're there for. You're there to get the experiences and the skill and the expertise. You're there to build the relationships, especially. You're there to have the strong reputation. And all of these things are, you're not always going to be able to, you can't just go out and grab career capital necessarily, but if you keep in mind how incredibly important it is, it can change the way you think about your career and how you approach it day in and day out. And that often means putting yourself out there, putting yourself out in situations where you could end up being rejected, or you could end up being mistreated. Because if you're really there to try to advance to the next level, it often requires putting yourself in that position, because otherwise you're not going to make it there either way. So obviously these are all generalized answers, and different people in very different situations might find that some of them aren't really applicable to them. Some of it may be more or less valuable, but hope it's generally useful.
Thank you. Yeah, there's some relevant questions in the chat. I'm trying to, a lot of them were just on the point that you were just making about what can individuals do. And there's a question here about, the racial discomfort with a mentor or manager that can be a constant challenge. And how do you recommend people slowly engage with their mentor to not play the race card in terms of racial discomfort, but work around risk management? And I think it's, it's an interesting question, or an interesting thing to consider, is like, where's that edge, between what I might be perceiving as racial discomfort and causing me to think very carefully about my racial risk management, but how do I know what's real, what's not? Any thoughts about the balance there?
Well, it's tough. And obviously, if I'm not there, I can't even give you my 2 cents as an outsider to weigh in on any particular situation. But I guess I would say I don't mean to suggest in any way that people should be oblivious. If somebody's mistreating you or have, despite your best efforts, really made it clear that they just have no use for you or have no interest in being helpful in any way, then you really have to find some way to work around them. That's the kind of situation where whatever is going on, whether it's racial bias, whether it's just some kind of interpersonal disconnect, whatever it is, if it's not going to improve, then you're going to be stuck. So for me, I think in situations like that, you have to try, but once it becomes clear, then you have to reassess and reevaluate. But in many other instances, it's not quite that clear. So there are many instances where maybe you two just haven't really, neither of you has really made the effort and extended yourself, or maybe you have other things you'd rather do in your free time, and so does that person. And so in those situations, I think that at the very least, you have to, again, put yourself out there and take the initiative and try, to the extent that it seems like it might lead to something, to build those relationships. And so I think, though, that can also mean sharing information, being yourself. And there's a debate about this among scholars. So I want to just flag that. There are people who would probably disagree with what I'm about to say. So I don't want to be misleading about that. But there's this whole debate about bringing your authentic self to work. And I actually think it's really important. And I think that a number of the people who I interview in the book who are very successful made a point to do that. And they speak about that very forcefully. And they'll let it be known, like, no, I'm black. I'm not here trying to leave myself at the door. And so obviously there's some situations where you might end up with people looking at you funny or making negative assumptions. But I think that the downside to not doing that can be just as damaging to your career, if not more so. So I think, I guess the main thing is, if I could just back up a second, I'm uncomfortable advising people generally like what to do with their careers, but I would just always say, keep in mind that the downsides that you don't see, that you're not thinking about, are sometimes even more damaging than the problems that you're trying to avoid. Anyway, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, no, it gets deep, which again is why I was so excited to read your book. But on that note, there was another concept that you talked about that I know I've heard in the insurance industry, and it kind of goes along the lines of, so many of the influencers in the insurance industry are golfers. Therefore, I took golf so that I could, have more of that FaceTime with them. And I can't remember the term that you used, but it was something about cultural assimilation or acculturation or something, where some of the people that you interviewed were intentional about learning or adapting or thriving in a culture that wasn't necessarily their own, but one that they recognized was important to their career advancement. Can you talk about that dilemma a little bit?
Sure. So I think the term I ended up settling on was strategic acculturation.
That's it.
And so the idea there isn't that you're assimilating to the extent that you're changing who you are, but you're intentionally going out and trying to get familiar with the cultural traits and preferences that they have. It's almost like becoming fluent in another language, so that you'll have that many more opportunities to build those relationships and to connect with them. And, it doesn't necessarily have to be changing who you are. I just want to make that clear. This isn't about you showing up to work on Monday with a new accent and everything. This is really just about figuring out what is it that helps people fit in and form the relationships here, And what can I do to take advantage of that myself? So you don't have to stay on the outside looking in some instances. Now, just to be clear, there's some places where they're just racially biased and they might reject you no matter what you bring to the table or how hard you try. And so I'm not talking about that specifically, but in many other instances, if you're willing to say, hey, and this is something that some of the people I interviewed actually mentioned in the book, I'd rather be at a lounge that's playing my kind of music, drinking what I like to drink, hanging with the people I like to hang with, but instead, I am going to go to our little informal happy hour at this dive bar across the street, and I'm going to listen to rock and roll, going to listen to people tell their stories about the golf course or about playing beer pong in college, and I'm going to laugh and try to fit in and soak up the information so that they see me as one of the gang, one of the group. And that's something that, again, it doesn't assure you success, but I talk to a lot of people who would tell you, they would say, I'm not that great at this job. There are people who are better than me, but because I'm more plugged in that way, I actually end up benefiting. So that's another thing I should have mentioned earlier. It's the kind of thing people can do to try to, I would just say, increase their odds. You know, it doesn't guarantee you any kind of outcome, but it's a way of increasing the chances that you'll be able to connect with someone, get the resources, get the opportunities that might help you take it to the next level. And golf is a great example of that, obviously.
Yeah, and again, I appreciate that it's all context dependent and people have to make these strategic decisions based on what's important to them and their own sort of dynamics. I thought it was a good structure to put out there for the reader. And again, you called that strategic acculturation. Is that what it was?
I believe so. Now I'm getting nervous because I haven't. I was juggling a few different possibilities, and that's
been a minute. But I think conceptually we all get it. And again, to our NAAIA members, you know, the opportunity is to think through what works for you and what works within your organization. There was another question in the chat that I wanted to just see if you wanted to touch on, and it was around the what's happening to diversity, equity, and inclusion situations in the United States today. I know this is not aligned with your work, but to the degree you have a perspective on the challenges that are being that corporate DEI initiatives are facing today. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that situation?
Sure. I mean, as a professor, I'm used to weighing in on all types of things that I don't really write about directly, but this is actually something I've paid a lot of attention to and read quite a bit about. I have mixed feelings, to be honest. I think there are a lot of people acting in bad faith who are just trying to get efforts to address racial inequality off the table. They're trying to do this in the work world, the corporate world and other workspaces. They're trying to do this in higher education by dismantling DEI bureaucracies. And they're even trying to do this when it comes to K through 12 education and making sure that people can't read about certain racial injustices and the sources of contemporary problems. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. There are people who have this agenda who are not people you can necessarily reason with. It's not like you can just explain what DEI really is and they'll go away. They have a bigger goal there. But that being said, I think that corporations and other institutions, when they can, are actually standing up to them. And I think people are trying, corporations and employers have their own reasons for wanting DEI in place. It can protect them from lawsuits, it can increase morale and productivity, it can have reputational benefits. And so I don't see employers and companies really running from this. I do think they're going to be more judicious in terms of who they invite in to speak or who they pay to lead training sessions, perhaps. And I think that there are going to be situations where they might decide that certain types of content is just maybe too inflammatory or too potentially offensive to some people. And so I think you'll see a shift there. I think you'll certainly see a shift in Obviously, the express consideration of race in hiring is something that's going to be, that you're not going to see that anymore. You're going to see people scale back on what's been referred to as diversity fellowships or diversity internships, or at the very least opening them up so they're not racially specific. So I think those types of changes are already occurring, and they're certainly going to continue occurring. But I do think that employers, in many instances, want to do better in this way, and I just don't see them walking away completely. That's just my 2 cents. I'd be interested in hearing yours, actually, but that's the sense I have.
Yeah, well, it's a great conversation for our next webinar. And I would just regretfully say that we're at the end of our time together, and wanting to invite you just to provide any closing thoughts you might have around what's important today. Does race still matter? What would you like to leave the NAAIA audience with as we close?
Sure. I guess just very briefly, first I want to thank everyone for showing up, and I hope that some of the content here and some of my comments were useful, or at least interesting enough to give you food for thought. I think these are incredibly challenging issues, and you should always be suspicious if someone claims to have all the answers or the simple ways to move beyond this. But of course, race remains a really big problem for a number of reasons. And I hope that I've helped expand the conversation on the various ways that race still matters. We know that discrimination and racial bias are still issues, and they feed into the racial discomfort. So I don't want to suggest that this is something that's completely separate from that. But all of these are disadvantages that Black professionals and other Black workers have to face if they're going to find their ways in some of these types of work settings and occupational fields. And so, I think that unfortunately there just aren't any easy answers, but I hope that people will keep in mind the trade-offs that come along with different strategic choices you might make in your career, and to always think about career capital as being the ultimate outcome. And finally, whether or not you get a chance to read my book, I would love to hear from you, love to hear your thoughts either on the presentation or on the book or anything else you happen to read. I'm always interested in learning how these types of dynamics affect people in certain different work settings and different careers, or how they don't apply. So would love your help with that.
Well, if what I'm seeing in the chat is any indication, there's a lot of positive reactions to your commentary and to your ideas. The other thing I'll just mention to our audience is that Professor Woodson also has 2 really well done YouTube videos out there that you can show perhaps as a thought starter to some of the events that you're doing with your colleagues. So just recognize that, yes, you can get the book, and I believe we've put that in the chat, but also you can just check him out on some very informative YouTube videos as well. Thank you. This has been exciting, really great work. Congratulations on it. We wish you continued success from NAAIA.
Thank you for watching this flashback episode of NAAIA. We appreciate your time and hope you found the insights valuable. Stay tuned for more enriching content. Until next time, thank you for being a part of the NAAIA community.